You may think I can just put out videos on a whim, that I make whatever comes to mind, but really over the last month I've started unstopped on like 5 different projects. I've had this bad habit recently of starting something and then not really knowing how to structure it. What if people get confused on something that I haven't addressed? How do you paint this? Well, there's a million different ways, but where do you start? Perhaps this is a sign I need to take more amphetamines. No, to give myself something to focus on, I wrote a list, alphabetical in its nature, going over various concepts related to miniatures. I'll be going over the letters, one by one, and I'll make a video relating to that letter. With that being said, A is for Airbrush. The Airbrush is one of the most useful tools available to us as modelers. While it boasts a high upfront cost, its functionality both as a painting tool and as a time saver cannot be overstated. I love my Airbrush, but I also want to state from the word go that it is not necessary for good results. I haven't painted much of mine for a while, so this will be a good refresher. Before we get to painting, we should examine what's even going on with this contraption. Airbrushes come in a variety of different styles, but they all function on the same basic mechanic. In a gravity-feed airbrush, the most common style, paint goes up top and sits in this breech area. It gets pulled out via a siphon of air that you release with the trigger. This area here allows paint to mix with the air and to be dispersed onto whatever is being painted. The trigger on the airbrush controls the amount of air being fed out of the business end of the tool via depression of the switch. If the trigger is only capable of doing this, it's a single action brush. The degree of paint being deposited gets controlled by a separate part. If you can pull the needle back and forth and control the amount of paint distributed, that is a dual action airbrush. Of the two, dual actions are a more finesse tool, but they do allow for more control over what is needed moment to moment, so I recommend them. How much should you spend to get started? That's a tricky question to answer, mostly because you don't need just the brush. You'll need an air hose, a moisture catch, depending on where you live, thinner, and some cleaning tools. More than that, however, you'll need to get a compressor. That'll run you another $100 to $200, depending on what model you get. I would not recommend going too far of the price here. I've had my own compressor for over a decade, and it's still going strong. I've had to replace the air tank once, sure, but the actual mechanical parts are still chugging away. If you happen to have an expressive compressor already, let me know in the comments as to why it's so much better. As for the airbrush itself, there are many different models and makes, and it's hard to say exactly what you should get. Off the top of my head, how much should you pay? $200. There are cheaper models and more expensive ones, but both have drawbacks here. The cheap models do work, but precision instruments like this always come with drawbacks when the costs get cut. I imagine that they must be frustrating to work with, and if you actually like the process, you just end up buying a better one in short order. But I would dissuade you from going to the opposite end and getting a very expensive model. They do allow for some incredible precision, and they are worth the money, but you need to be very cognizant of the paint dilution and how to finger the trigger. They are a higher skill ceiling, higher skill floor class of tool. Very high precision also doesn't allow for very large surface painting, which is half the reason you want an airbrush in the first place. Ultimately, they're your second airbrush, not your first. As for the air pressure you use to spray with, first, RTFM, but most brushes at this level use 25 to 40 psi. Too little and you can't actually do anything with the brush, too much you start stressing the components. More air also means better spraying, more reliable spraying, but also more hassle. Less air requires a better finesse in the paint dilution, but softer spraying, which might be beneficial. I would suggest trying different pressures and seeing how they work out for you. Regardless of how much pressure you do end up using, or for what purpose, an airbrush won't work unless the main parts in question are in proper order, and this means an occasional cleaning. Thankfully, this is very simple. A soak and some basic degreaser is enough to strip paint from the parts. While almost all the small parts of the brush can be soaked without harm and then just cleaned with a little toothbrush, the main body is a bit of a different story. There's a fair amount of sensitive components concerning the air intake, and that has to be respected. The upper 50% is fine to soak, but you need to keep this latter half dry. I soaked mine in a cup of simple green and water, and I have yet to see any real problems over the course of a decade of work. Then, you gotta put the thing together again. With most airbrushes, this is not a huge problem. You fiddle around with the parts and you can figure it out just fine. But one thing worth noting is the back end cover here. This is to prevent the needle from screwing up the entire mechanism if the thing falls over and whacks onto it. Personally, I don't use this. It gets in the way of the workflow and doesn't even balance the tool that well. In the over 10 years I've had this thing, I've only blundered like that once, versus the thousands of times I had to unscrew the end chuck to spray out paint. It's a matter of practicality more than anything. To demonstrate the power of the airbrush here, I'll be painting Miao Ying, the Storm Dragon. The first step is in subassembly, which I tend to avoid as it greatly increases the workload, but since the airbrush is so general, and the structure of metal so different from the surrounding area, I feel it necessary to paint these parts separated from the whole. We come to the first major advantage the airbrush gives us, the priming. I spoke briefly on this in the priming video, but this is a major advantage of the tool here. Aerosol primers may have the airbrush beat in terms of surface area coverage and resilience to abrasion, making them viable for mass painting strategies. They are not precise tools, however, and they take finesse to use on small scales. Additionally, the weather conditions have to be right for their use, and that's not always possible. Airbrush primers are far more controllable and usable, rain or shine. Such examples include Molotow and Montana pen refills. Both are used in street art pens and grip tightly to a variety of surfaces, making them perfect for modeling. Both are also very matte and receptive to paint. Molotow's 1-for-all black is actually a satin finish, but I found it takes paint well, which is what I'm going to be using here. There are two major questions about airbrushing. How much paint should I spray at the time, and how much do I thin it down? The answer to both is the same. It depends on what you're trying to do. Let me address the former. When the goal is to cover your surface, you can spray quite liberally, but it's in how you do it. You may be tempted to pull the trigger all the way back and just unload onto the surface, but this is a recipe for disaster. That amount of paint is simply too much and will overwhelm the surface, thus removing detail. Even when I'm being very heavy-handed, I almost never move beyond a 50% air to paint ratio, and only in short bursts. I can always add more paint, it's fine. Regardless, in the beginning you want to ease the trigger back and forth before you go bursting around, as you have enough to consider of the process already. As you learn how your tool works, you'll begin to start painting in bursts like I do. In regards to paint thinning, it all depends on the goal of the work. If you're putting down a base coat at the very start of your job, then you want to get the paint out without issue. If you're doing fine transition work for Golden Demon, the answer is different. There are two thinning options for us, thinners and flow improvers. Thinners are mediums that contain some extra additives to improve the flow of the paint and to keep it together in the pot. Flow improvers slow dry time as to reduce tip dry and to keep your work going without issue. They are not, however, interchangeable. For certain light colors like white, just thinner may not be enough to make the work go smoothly. You may need to add some flow improvers so the thing doesn't dry out too much. But if you add too much, you may start to mess with the paint's adhesion to the surface, as the paint doesn't actually dry as you spray it. So that can really screw you up if you don't take into account. But how much is too much or too little? You must learn by doing. It's not nearly as much as you think. There are far too many variables to give you an exact recipe. Say you're painting an opaque base layer and you don't want transparency. In such circumstance, you only need to get the paint for the tool. Therefore, you need just enough thinner. If you're filtering color into your work, the answer is different. How vibrant is the color? How fluid is it? Is it naturally transparent? What's the effect you want? The answer to each of those ideas is different. In this circumstance, I'm laying down some red oxide over my black to create a tonal sketch over my work, which will use a lot of transparent, vibrant colors. The purpose here is to build up an opaque layer of lighter and lighter color, so I can use transparency later. With additional thinner comes additional transparency of the paint, which is not wanted in this stage, so I thin the paint to a consistency that works well for my needs, but no more than that. As I move up in tonality, I could add in white paint, but that could throw off the fluidity of my mixture, and I like it as it is right now. I could, instead, include a highly flowing paint that works in the airbrush from the word go, and has the properties I need in this instance. In this case, an increase of tonality, aka white ink. These inks are invaluable materials for airbrushing and worth investing into. Starting to notice a pattern here? I sure am. Most inks dry of a gloss finish when applied pure. If that's undesirable, then a bit of matte varnish can help kill the shine. The most common problem that arises of the airbrush is good old tip dry. As paint and air moves over the needle of the tool, it collects over the surface and begins to block flow. Eventually, the tip jams with paint and it can't spray properly, especially at 99% air levels. Thankfully, this is fixable with a toothbrush. Just kind of rub it all over the needle and it should break up everything. If that still doesn't work, you can remove the cover and pull the paint off with your fingers, although you gotta be careful not to prick yourself here. This needle has to remain sharp and pointy in order to work effectively. The goal I'm trying for here is to recreate the iridescent effect of something like this figure beetle with its vibrant iridescent shell. The camera doesn't even capture the cool blue-green notes in the shadows properly, but hopefully I can show off the effects of the painting. I begin my process of Aldari Emerald contrast paint, which, being so liquid, works straight into the airbrush without any dilution or thinning. If you do not have this specific paint, you can use Phthalo Green Blue shade. I'm willing to go out on a limb here and say that these colors are identical. The only real reason I'm using contrast here is that the finish is matte, and I want this initial coloring to be a bit more receptive to future painting. Satin finishes can be a little slick for the airbrush to grip onto. As you can see, I start my work very light, just checking how the color behaves and how intense it is. With such vibrant colors, it's easy to screw up and blast too much on. I want to modulate this stage later, so this initial coloring needs to be even and not too intense. You can only put more paint and color on with an airbrush. Taking it off, that's harder. For regards to the leftover paint, since I haven't modified the color in any way, I'll just dispense it back into the reserve. The leftover paint in the reservoir I spray out into a jug. Don't bother those tiny little spray out bottles, they're worthless and fill up too quickly. A gallon jug is a perfect thing for this. To create effective transitions, you do not need to fully clean the airbrush between colors. After I spray out, I leave the residue inside, and we'll move on to the next color. Here I use a little Chimera Velvet Phthalo Blue ink and start deepening my shadows. These colors are somewhat new to the market, and despite the name, they are not true inks in the way I see them. They function a little more as highly fluid and pigmented paints that exhibit a matte finish and a strong versatility. But they do possess a thickness more akin to ink mixed with paint than rather the water nature of ink. I think they're worth experimenting with. I clean my tool and I go straight in with pure vivid lime green ink. Despite the label of transparency, I find this color is a bit more along the lines of a semi-opaque / semi-transparent color, and it can actually layer up over the sketch just a bit, so do be wary of that. Using some Chimera Sunray, I start putting down opaques, light zones that will define my highest lights. If you do not have this color, ice yellow works perfectly well as a replacement, or just mix some yellow in with some white, the result is the same. My airbrush cup has gotten a bit dirty after all this time painting, and since I want to move into more transparent work, this opaque pigment inside has got to go. I spray in some plain old water and use a Fix-It brush from Princeton Select. These are supposed to be like a sort of, an eraser brush for canvas work, but I find them to be the perfect airbrush cleaning tools with their very stiff bristles. To refine these lights, I first move into them with a mixture of phthalo blue and phthalo green yellow shade, mixed with some thinner to reduce the intensity of these powerful colors. This helps move the lights into a warmer spectrum without too harsh a jump from the cool green body to the warmer yellow-green of the light. Then I move into the pure yellow shade and start covering them up. You can see how radiant this is when I layer it over the light tones. Then I repeat the process with a bit more sunray and a bit of white ink, redefining the lights and setting myself up for more definition. Sometimes we try things and they don't work out as intended. That doesn't mean the whole work is a lost cause. Here, I thought using some green gold as my final light would work, as this tone is pretty much as yellow a green as there is. But I didn't quite account for the fact that it's a little muted in its saturation. This coloring isn't bad, certainly for another dragon it would actually be a fine progression, but it's not what I want here. So, I go back to lime green from before and I layer it on before I go too far. Same goes with this ultramarine blue in the shadows. Here, the blue is a little matte in its finish, which is okay, but the blue isn't quite there. It lacks the visual bite that iridescent effect possesses. Only one blue has that intensity, phthalo blue. Before I go there, I add just a bit of white to the shadow areas to give the blue something to work off of. Then, I go in with the pure stuff. This color, even more so than the phthalo green, is eye-wateringly vibrant and should be reserved for special effects. It works out here for what I want, but beware of using on the palette, lest your entire model become a blue haze. Let's have some fun. Blue interference goes into the shadows. These interference colors work best over dark tones, and they add a little luminosity to them by increasing the depth and reflectivity, as well as to help sell the iridescent effect here. True iridescence is sort of outside the range of paint to create because it relies heavily on transparency and material science that's a little outside of a basic paint's ability. But it can be suggested with some additional nudging, like this interference effect. I could extend this to the light area, but I think it's interesting enough as it is on the dragon. To create extra interest, I paint the scales a deep brown with iron oxide and phthalo blue, which will progress in a similar manner as other scales. Hopefully this will create the bottom shell's progression from arena brown a bit more faithfully. I paint the horn, claws, and other scaly bits with a brush. The airbrush is a very useful tool, but it does struggle to work in super tight areas like this. A brush is a far more precise instrument and suits these areas far better. You could get in real tight with the tool, but why would you? This is a far simpler procedure. Claws get a quick blast of sun rays to give them some pop and to catch the eye. The underbelly gets a similar progression as the main body. The only substantial difference here is I use a bit of burnt sienna before I use phthalo blue to create my transition to shadow. The burnt sienna lowers this area's vibrancy and creates a good setup for the resulting shadows. A head is an obvious focal area, and his painting is a little frustrating to work on with the main body, so I separate the two. Or did I intentionally not glue it in place, knowing that I would have to work on it in the future? You decide. Regardless, breaking a piece off at a joint like this is far from the worst thing ever. Almost everything we do in life can be fixed. It's just a matter of how much effort is needed to do so. I thought about purely airbrushing this area, but from the weird geometry of the head, it kind of forces my hand to use a brush. While I base the hair and I glue the head back on, consider that difficult areas of your model are a lot easier to access if you accept some future corrections. Is that time worth it? You decide. To prevent the hair from getting too vibrant and perhaps clashing with the intense coloring of the body, I progress the lights using some vivid lime green, this time with white in it, and paint in some light bands. Time for the frills. I first mix up some phthalo green blue shade and some of the Sigval burgundy, and I try this mixture first. Okay, that's too bluish. More red. Okay, better. The mouth gets a purple tongue and some redder interiors with more burgundy, along with the purple whiskers. While I have the paint on the brush, I give the head a bit of a wash to help redefine the recesses present. I went through this whole process to paint the metal armor, only to kinda screw it up, so let me save you the trouble and show you the correct process. I began with some neutral gray and a spot of Prussian blue to create a cool gray color to base everything with. Then I check the angle of the light and begin creating my reflections. How to make a metallic effect like this is outside the scope here, but in effect, I set up my main light reflections first after setting the base tone, then refine them with some achromatic blue, and create secondary reflections using burnt sienna in the shadows. Then I glaze everything in the achromatic blue and redefine my lights. The whole model is really starting to come together now. It's also beginning to remind me of something. I'm not really sure and can't put my finger on it, but it is very familiar. Anyway, I set my wet palette and get to refining. Here's the colors I used. Without brushwork to set up strong definition, a model is apt to get a strange, hazy look that lacks solidity. That level of intention is only possible with a brush. I start by coloring in the hard, spiky bits in the armored scales, and cut in some of these straps as well. Most of the brushwork concerns the head, as it is a significant focal area. When you're refining, what areas should you paint? Well, whatever you want, but a good idea to keep in mind when doing this type of refinement is ABD. Always be drawing. By drawing, I mean defining form. If something is vague and difficult to see, it will doubly be so from a distance, so give it a little bit of brightness with a brush. How much you do so is up to you, but remember, if everything has the same level of emphasis, nothing does. What parts stand out, and which are more subdued is your decision, but you want to give every distinct shape and volume a little bit of attention. An example is these teeth, which are always a priority in my book. The key to painting them is not to go straight to white. When you do that, you have nowhere to go. Also, white covers like ass and needs to be built up to work, so it's a practical reason as well. I start with brown made from that iron oxide and Prussian blue just to neutralize them from the form of painting, and start working up in value by including sunray. Then I mark them with a very high, yellowish tint of white. Technically speaking, this is more realistic than a pure white, as healthy teeth are actually a little yellow at their healthiest. They only look white by comparison to the rest of the face, or via chemical treatment. But to make them pop and to fit more modern conventions, I use a bit of pure white to finish them and to really make them gleam. I continue my process of definition with lightness and darkness. One key feature here with these swirly elements on the armor is to use some dark lining oil painting. To do this, I make a quick black-green mix with oil and some white spirit. Then, using a pen, I dot in some defined lines. And don't worry, I'll explore this in greater detail in the future. For now, I just force the white spirit to evaporate off of my heat gun and scrub away excess with some cotton buds. Then, I define the swirls with paint. Most people believe that you can't paint acrylic over oil, which is mostly true in canvas work because the oil shrinks and prevents good adhesion. But in modeling, since the surfaces don't move very much, this is not nearly as much of a risk. And if you sufficiently remove the oil or you varnish the surface matte, the surface will take the paint reasonably well. I hope this was helpful for you to learn some basics of airbrushing. At the end of the day, the tool is a time saver and an effective method of glazing color, but just like any tool, subject to its own learning curve. Speaking of learning, I will be attending Las Vegas Open in October, and I will be teaching there as well. I have 4 classes available on 3 different subject matters, and you should buy them and learn from me directly. You really should buy those classes. Okay, look here, man. I had to buy RAM in order to get this video to render because it just wasn't working otherwise, and I am now financially destitute. Buy the classes!